Welcome, everyone, to this final edition of The Doorstep. I'm your co-host, Nick Vosdev, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council.
And I'm Tatiana Serafin, also Senior Fellow here at Carnegie Council, welcoming you for our final episode, as Nick said, but with the best guest ever, Peter Goodman, Global Economics Correspondent for the New York Times, who literally just yesterday, I believe, right?
Just yesterday.
Came out with How the World Ran Out of Everything. Which I think is an important read for us today as we almost forget about the pandemic, but it's still with us and ramifications are still with us. And this book is timely and relevant. But most importantly, I think for us here at The Doorstep, it relates to what we wanted to do here over the last 4 years, which is bring international affairs and tie it to our everyday issues and concerns. And if I could read what you write about what you cover, you say, I write about the intersection of economics and geopolitics with an emphasis on the consequences for ordinary people. Ordinary people, that's what we want to talk about today, is how the world ran out of everything and how ordinary people were affected by this. And I want to start with you, because one of the anecdotes in the book is about your own family and what you suffered at your doorstep.
Right.
And I want to start out with that story because I think it's very poignant and very telling as a lead-in to this conversation today.
You bet. So we were living in London, more fortunate than most people on planet Earth. My wife and I could both work from home. We had a little outdoor space, which gave the kids who were cooped up dealing with distance learning, some activity. We weren't that far away from a park. We were never in terrible physical danger. But like everyone else, we were dealing with this bewildering experience. And not incidentally, our third child was born on April 8th, 2020, in the middle of lockdown London. And my wife was quite stoic about the whole thing. I could be in the hospital for an hour or two the day of the birth, and I had to go home. She was there for a couple of days. We had obviously no ability to have her parents fly over from New York to help out. I mean, there was any family having a newborn is dealing with their life getting turned upside down, and to deal with a pandemic on top of that. But where it was striking that she finally reached her breaking point. Was understanding the fact that the doctors couldn't come to our house for their usual checkups. All of that was thrown out of the way. We get home, and suddenly she's trying to order hand sanitizer. There's no hand sanitizer. She tries to order the ingredients for hand sanitizer so we can make it. Not possible. She urges me to stockpile toilet paper. That was wise. I tuned that out, dealing with other stuff, and now I'm, it's like wartime. I'm begging the person at the local grocery store to tell me when the truck's going to come in. And then I remember she said at one point, it's like we're waiting for this baby and this magical experience, and he's here, he's healthy, and the world is just turned upside down. Again, we had it better than most, but I think that in a time where we don't agree about much these days, but I think we have this faith that the supply chain, this thing that we don't even talk about or think about most of the time, is going to function the way we flip on a light switch, and we don't know what's happening behind the scenes, but the lights always come on unless they don't, and then it's somewhat startling. This was cosmically bewildering. It was a sign that we were lacking adult supervision, that the whole global economy was somehow out of whack, such that this unseen army of people, who again, we don't really think about, but I've written a book about, and I think we're going to talk about, who are participants in making the stuff that we depend on. Some frivolous stuff, some not frivolous stuff, like medical devices and computer chips that are required to run them, things like hand sanitizer in the middle of a pandemic. That this could all fail was really disconcerting in a deep way.
And, how did you then get into the story? And I want to talk about, because this was one of your strengths in this piece for me is your people stories.
Oh, great.
Every piece of the supply chain that you were going to talk about, you find a person to, be emblematic of what is happening at your doorstep. And one of those people is Hagen Walker.
Right.
How did you meet him? Today he posted on your LinkedIn, a fortuitous meeting. What was the fortuitous meeting? How did you know it was him that was going to lead you into the story?
Well, I started doing some supply chain stories when I was doing some Brexit stories, actually, still living in London and looking into various trade disruptions from Britain leaving the European Union. And somehow I found myself talking to somebody in Ireland who told me that the cost of moving a container, this is, the basic building block of international trade, these steel boxes that move stuff around the world. The cost of moving a container of factory goods from Asia to Europe had gone up like tenfold in the space of a couple of months. And at first I thought, well, that's a part of Brexit that I've never heard about. And I did a little bit of digging and figured out that this was a global phenomenon, that there was a shortage of shipping containers in China, and that was, I didn't know anything about shipping at that point, but as I reveal in the book, it's this really unregulated international cartel, and every time there's a shock to the system, it's a moment where they can jack up the prices, and they had done that. And so I did that story. I did a story on the implications of just-in-time delivery, which is, the famous Toyota production system, this genius idea going back to the end of the Second World War, that instead of factories making as much stuff as they possibly could, let's just make enough to replenish what we've already sold, and let's get our suppliers to do likewise. And as I lay out in the book and in that piece, that's turned into this kind of crude imperative to just slash inventory. Why waste money warehousing parts as a hedge against some trouble that's probably not happening the next quarter, and corporate CEOs only care about the next quarter. Let's just save the money, give it to ourselves as executive compensation, give it to investors through dividends. And along the way, I figured out, oh, this is actually a book. This is, how did this happen? There's monopoly power, there's just in time, and there are the people who are at the center of this book. There was all this talk of, labor shortages. We've run out of truck drivers, as if truck drivers have just lost their will to work somehow. So I wanted to dig into this, and I thought the natural narrative device is follow a shipping container from a factory town in China to somewhere in North America, and I started casting around it. It was actually kind of difficult. I talked to a bunch of publicly traded companies. Would you be willing to let me dive into your history of shipping and correspondence and understand all of your factory operations? And they said, we've never been asked that. We'll think about it. And I almost got there with a couple companies. And then I started responding to the emails that PR people bombard all reporters with at all times. How would you like to write the inspiring profile of, this dog trainer who is now using, vegan treat? Well, no, I'm not going to do that. But here's what I'm really looking for. And I started just responding. I'm looking for somebody who will let me understand how they moved a shipping container from China to North America. And eventually I found Freightos, which is sort of like the Expedia of shipping containers. You can book right there. And they served me a Hagen Walker, who I talked to, immediately realized he was the perfect guy to follow for the story. He's an entrepreneur living in his college town of Starkville, Mississippi, degree in engineering, had turned down a job at Tesla after being an intern there because he was really excited to stay in his town, buy up this cool old movie theater, and turn it into a warehouse for his startup company that was making these novelty cubes, these like light up cubes. You drop them in a drink and they light up, and a bartender could immediately look down the bar and see that the light went out and somebody's ready for a refill. That had turned out that these were really useful to parents with autistic children, for whom bath time is often a hellish experience, and the light up cube soothed a kid who has autism and had this trouble. So suddenly this had turned into a deal with Sesame Street to make Elmo-themed bath toys, and Hagen Walker was willing to let me come down to Mississippi and follow him around and root through months of correspondence to understand how his single container on a ship with 12,000 of them, one container, the first full container load he'd ever had, try to get Elmo back to the U.S. in time for the holiday season, his first order for Sesame Street in 2021, gets stuck floating in this giant queue with 60 other ships off the port of Long Beach, California for weeks. And I recognized that if I could trace that, if I could talk to the factory that made these products in China, if I could figure out how the truck industry fit in, the rail industry, warehouses, that was going to be a way to take a lay reader, because this book's written for everyone. I mean, businesses, I think, will be interested because we've sort of ignored supply chain as this unsexy subject for a long time until finally it's now become, dinner party conversation. It's something I didn't expect to see happen. But this would be the way to get to the regular people who animate the story.
I really appreciate the book. It's fitting to end the doorstep run with it because so many of the themes we've explored over the last 4 years are present here. Not just the supply chains, but also questions about consultants, politics, the geopolitics, the international relations, decoupling, inequality, regulation. So many issues are there. And as I'm reading it, one of the things that struck me, and this was a pre-pandemic ad that people may recall for MasterCard that starred Christina Cabello, where she's walking down the street in New York. She has her smartphone out. She's tapping on it and is, providing shoes, cupcakes, goods and services as she's, to people on the stoops. And that seemed to epitomize, as you said, the supply chain notion that we just flip a switch and we don't understand really how it works, but we expect it to be there until it wasn't. But I wanted to then get to the point which I really thought that you developed in the book, and maybe to have you explain it more, which is that this didn't happen by accident.
Right.
We make conscious choices. We make conscious choices to deregulate. We make conscious choices not to stockpile. Companies make conscious choices to prioritize dividends over capacity. Can you maybe walk us through, the saga of how do we get to the world running out of everything?
I mean, the short version is we essentially entrusted publicly traded companies and the concept that scale and deregulation are the solution to all of our life's problems. And we said, let's just run with that. This story, people like to start that story with Reagan, who's obviously very important. It really starts with Carter. Carter deregulated trucking, Carter deregulated shipping and rail. And really, ever since, we've been marinated in this idea that, as Reagan then famously put it, government's not the solution; it's the problem. But ultimately, this is a book about how this narrow obsession with handing Wall Street what it supposedly craves will be good for all of us. And it turns out that's a good way to give Wall Street what it craves right now. But it's not even a good way to give the investor class what it wants. And I'll give you an example. We've talked about just-in-time manufacturing. So the American rail system, and there's a lot of history in the book, from the beginning of time, going back to the robber barons. The story of rail in the United States is the story of investor interests taking precedence over everything. The safety of workers, the basic decency of the people working on the railroads, to the interests of shippers to get their stuff from one place to another. Well, there's a version of just-in-time in railroads called precision scheduled railroading. In the last few years, this has been, the lodestar for the rail industry, and it's a fancy way of saying, let's fire lots of people, let's take rail engines out of commission, let's force the people doing the maintenance work who are away from their families for months at a time, missing, the births of children, the deaths of relatives, not able to be home for scheduled surgeries in some cases. And let's make these people work harder than ever. And then let's come up with some metrics that we'll use to show the investors that we're more efficient than ever. And here's where this goes. In the middle of the pandemic, this is a story I tell in the book, there's an engineer out in Idaho who's working for Union Pacific, one of the biggest monopoly rail companies in America, and he discovers that his train is actually pulling cars that are going to the wrong places. And he realizes that what's going on is that under precision scheduled rail, which is all about showing Wall Street, look at these numbers, we're with the program, we're so efficient. At the moment, they're obsessed with something called the dwell time, the amount of time that a rail car is sitting in a rail yard. And as long as whatever we're doing is lowering dwell time, that's going to make our share price go up, which is going to make all the corporate bosses happy. So somebody at a rail yard in Nebraska decides, well, here are these cars. They're supposed to go to California. We don't have a train going to California, but we got one going to Oregon. Good enough. Let's put them on that train. Never mind that there are car parts There are drums of chemicals that somebody in California is waiting for to make their product so that somebody else, maybe your family trying to paint your kitchen, maybe some medical device manufacturer in San Diego, needs to make their product. And this rail operator realizes, I am actually carrying this stuff to the wrong place because that's my job. These are the incentives. Now, this is an instance where even the shareholder should feel ripped off. That's the system that we've built through this obsession with deregulation, scale, combined with financialization.
And I think the scale issue isn't just in railroads, right? You mentioned it's trucking. It is across the board. It's in shipping. And the government has given up regulating, and so this has also led to even more problems because there's, as you said at the top of our conversation, there's nobody manning the ship. There's nobody looking out.
Yeah, I mean, it's really perverse. I decided in digging into shipping, a lot of this book is about shipping. I'd been talking to importers who had been paying $2,500 under their contracts to move container furniture companies, apparel companies that assemble gift baskets, drawing on factories often in China. And they had these contracts. Okay, I can move my 40-foot container for $2,500 from Shanghai or Shenzhen to Los Angeles or Long Beach. And suddenly the pandemic shock, shipping companies say, well, actually, we don't have space on the ship under your contracted rate. But if you pay a special rate, we might. How much is the special rate? Well, there's various handling charges, $25,000. People are shocked by this, so they start protesting. This becomes such a problem. I mean, I open the book with the mother of all traffic jams, this queue of ships floating off the ports, that no less a figure than President Biden appoints a czar to go down to the ports and figure out what's going on. And he gives this speech, actually uses a State of the Union to say shipping companies are the reason why we have these big queues, and that's why we have inflation, which of course is a huge problem for him, right now, and it was going into the 2022 midterms. And I spent a lot of time with a guy named Dan Maffei, who's a former congressman from upstate New York, who's the chair of this obscure body, then obscure, the Federal Maritime Commission. Dan Maffei had lost his seat. He was casting about for his next job. He met with some former Obama people. What do you got? They said, well, there's a seat on this commission. Oh, the Consumer Product Safety Commission? That could be interesting. No, the Federal Maritime Commission. Oh, I think I've heard of that. So he's given this job, sleepy job. He's big office with models of container ships and old oil paintings of maritime history. And suddenly he's the guy who Joe Biden has appointed to sort out the inflation problem heading into the 2022 midterms. And there's a passage of this thing called the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022. And he's supposed to bring the shipping industry to heel so that you can't rip off importers or exporters. I spent time with almond farmers in the Central Valley of California who, when I was out there in the spring of 2022, are sitting on an entire year, like a whole crop of almonds, mostly sold to buyers in Japan and Dubai. They can't get the ships to stop in Oakland to pick up their crop because the shipping companies, again, a cartel, there's three basic alliances that dominate 95+% of the traffic from Asia to the West Coast of the US. They're making so much money moving factory goods from China to the West Coast of the US that they're not even bothering to send the empty ones up to the Central Valley to pick up almonds like they usually do. They're sending the empties. They're shipping air. They're burning diesel fuel to send empty containers back across the Pacific as quickly as possible to go cash in on this bonanza of charging people 10 times as much to move this stuff. So here I am talking to Dan Maffei, the Federal Maritime Commission chair, who's going to sort all this out. And we're having breakfast in Washington. And he says, well, I'm kind of nervous about pushing the shipping carriers too far, because I'm worried that they might not serve us. They don't have to serve us. Now, you parse that. This is still the largest economy on earth. Still like to think that the United States kind of has a little bit of clout in the global economy. But the guy who's tasked with sorting this out is essentially saying, we're at the mercy of these foreign carriers who have all the muscle. So we're just going to have to kind of do the best we can and suck it up. And to discover that many of the products of the modern world that we all depend on are dependent upon that. That's profoundly frightening. And that, by the way, this is not the history of the pandemic. This is the present and the future, because we're going to have more shocks, and that basic market structure has not changed.
On that point, maybe you can discuss a bit more, because you do this in the book, that there's this sort of popular belief, well, we'll just bring manufacturing back to the U.S., right? Forget the shippers. We'll just reopen factories here. And can you maybe discuss a bit more about, as you say, particularly at the end, about how decoupling, de-risking sounds great in theory, but how difficult it is to bring manufacturing back to the United States, given certainly the advantage China has, and perhaps maybe Mexico might be able to affect that at the margins. But,
sure. So-called nearshoring, like moving stuff from faraway factory zones to closer to the market where you're selling stuff. That's happening in the margins. It's not going to happen. We're not going to abandon China. China's going to remain the center of global manufacturing into the foreseeable future, because it's got an unbeatable combination of efficiency, very large workforce, even though wages are up a bit. It's got all the infrastructure. That's not going away. The geopolitics are complicated. We can get into if you want. I mean, the Trump tariffs on Chinese exports, now the Biden tariffs continue. There's a lot to talk about there. But there is a movement, and I write about this in the book, for manufacturing companies to look to Mexico. You can get from anywhere in Mexico to anywhere in North America in a couple weeks maximum. If you're in a border state like Nuevo Leon, you can ship into Texas in a matter of hours by rail or road. Some of that's happening. I spent time with Columbia Sportswear, which is based outside of Portland, Oregon. They're looking to move some of their production from Asia to Guatemala. I followed them around as they look. It's hard to know how much of this will stick, because the basic incentive that if you are a corporate executive and you're saying, yeah, let's spend some extra money to be more resilient. I mean, that's the new talk. Consultancies like McKinsey that have been proselytizing for just in time for years are now saying we overdid it. We need just in case. That's all true, but you are diluting this quarter's earnings if you're proposing to spend money to fill warehouses with extra parts, to move your production around. That's complicated. So this so-called reshoring is something that people are talking about more and more. Some of that's happening. I tell the story of this guy, Taylor Shoup, who he's the guy behind Stance socks. Jay-Z has a song about Stance socks. NBA players love them. You probably see them at airports. They're these highly designed, kind of cool, comfortable socks. And so this is a guy who spent a lot of his career in China figuring out how to make stuff cheaply for the U.S. market. He's now got a factory north of San Diego where he's got all local workers. He's making a new sock brand called Future Stitch. And for him, he's a very social media conscious, fashion conscious guy. His thing is made in China has now actually become a branding liability, from awareness of the shipping problems to awareness of the accusations that China's using slaved labor in Xinjiang, repression of the Uyghurs, where a lot of cotton comes from. So there is this move afoot to get out from under the Chinese supply chain. And some of that is happening. I just came back from a couple weeks in India where Walmart is moving production also to get out from under the tariffs and to just diversify away from this heavy reliance on China. But the same basic incentive structure is there for executives. So we'll have to see what happens. People tend to lose their memories of shocks when low prices can be found.
And I was struck, just to touch on that Hagen's experience going to Vietnam, thinking he's going to diversify, and Vietnamese factory owners saying, by the way, all of our components are going to come from China.
That's right. Yeah, so that was like a conversation stopper for him. I mean, Hagen, who's a guy who actually wants to make stuff in the States, but just can't find the capacity here. He did go to Vietnam, And he was thinking about Vietnam. Then he was thinking about Cambodia. And then at one point we had this conversation. He said, I'm just going to stay in China, because he showed me this app. He can go on Alibaba, which is bigger than Amazon. He can put out a request for a proposal. I need a certain number of electronics components for my cubes. And he said, in a matter of minutes, I've got 20 bids from factories around China. I've got reviews like on Amazon telling me other people's experiences with these factories. I can talk to the factories in real time. There's somebody who speaks English, who's responsive 24/7 via various channels. He said, if I go to Cambodia or Vietnam and I try to recreate this, that would take me 2 years. What I can do in 15 minutes on this app. So it's hard to break up with China if you're in manufacturing. China's got a lot of stuff that's very useful.
And they're moving to Mexico. I thought that was an interesting part of your book. All the Chinese companies are now setting up in Mexico as well to take advantage of the nearshoring.
I mean, Chinese companies are not going to walk away from the world's largest consumer market. And Mexico is part of this North American trade deal. And a lot of Chinese companies, I visited this industrial park that's got 28 Chinese companies in it. These are companies that most people have not heard of, but they're supplying Walmart, Target with furniture, clothing. I talked to a guy at a wheel company. This is a company that makes aluminum wheels, and they sell to companies like General Motors and Ford. And I said, well, what are you doing here? He said, well, General Motors and Ford basically said, if you want to serve our North American factories, you got to be closer. So here we are.
I want to go back to some of the people stories, because you spent some time with some truck drivers.
Yeah.
And I want
to hear more about that and maybe share that with our audience, because that's really a doorstep issue, right? They're taking stuff from the world and bringing it to where it needs to go, and yet nobody talks about the lifestyle that has to happen.
Yeah, I will never drive past a truck on the highway without giving a thought to who's in the cab again. So, let's remember that while we're experiencing these floating traffic jams off the ports, and while we're finding out that we can't get a car, we can't get the kitchen cabinet we ordered, whatever, we're told by the trucking industry, oh yes, there's this shortage of truck drivers. And so I decided to look into this, and I spent 3 days traveling with a truck driver in the best possible circumstances. This is a guy who likes his job, has been doing it for 20 years, is very good at it, takes it very seriously, Stephen Graves. And we're driving from Kansas City down to Dallas to drop off a shipment, picking stuff up, a Walmart shipment, dog food, salsa, contact lenses, and we're driving north, retracing our steps through Oklahoma and Kansas, back to Kansas City. I'm with him for 3 days and 2 nights. I'm sleeping in the back of the cab. And my biggest takeaway is, man, you would not be doing this job if you had some more stable way to earn a living. I mean, this has always been a difficult job, but it used to be a high-paying job back when the Teamsters organized the workers. Now, the Teamsters are obviously a controversial union, tied up in the history of Jimmy Hoffa, but that story demonstrates that when you got a union behind you, you have a say over your working conditions and your wages. And yeah, you're away from your family, you're behind the wheel of a truck. It's tough, but you're getting paid decent money. Today's truck drivers, they spend all of their time worrying about where they're going to park. They're worried about falling asleep at the wheel. I mean, as Stephen Graves put it to me, if you're not scared out here, you're a fool. It takes more than the length of a football field to stop a truck. So you're constantly thinking, how am I going to caffeinate so I don't fall asleep at the wheel, but not have to stop to use the restroom again? At one point, we stopped at a truck stop in a little town, Springer, Oklahoma. Nothing there at all, next to a big gun dealership. And we pulled up there because there was ample parking, and he didn't want to worry about having to pull off on the side of the highway somewhere. Walked in with him to this this kind of convenience store, and dinner, shrink-wrapped turkey sandwich, couple of Pop-Tarts, one for dessert, one for breakfast. It's very difficult to get any exercise. This is a tough job, and a lot of the worst part is that in this just-in-time world, these people are treated as if their time is like limitless and valueless because they spend a lot of time sitting at warehouses hoping that someone will fill up their container quickly, but not knowing they're not getting paid by the hour. They're getting paid for the delivery of the load, the miles that they complete. This was one of the reasons why we ran out, air quotes, of truck drivers in the middle of the pandemic. We've got roughly 10 million people who have commercial driver's licenses in the United States. We need about a third that many. This is industry lobbying talk. What we've run out of is people willing to sign off on this miserable deal. There's predatory lending involved. I spent time with a so-called dray operator. These are the people who drive short-haul trucks, mostly from ports to warehouses out in LA. And this guy had signed off on a predatory lending scheme to buy a truck. He ended up spending 3 times as much as he could have gotten it himself, but he didn't have the cash for that because he accepted free training from a giant trucking company, which put him on the hook to drive for these guys for a couple of years. And, he's missing his daughter's school graduation. He's away for weeks. It puts a strain on marriage. I mean, this is a thing I heard again and again, not just in trucking, but in rail, that it's just very tough on relationships. I mean, that's a lot of jobs, but to layer on top of that, the financial worry of how am I going to pay my bills even though I'm away from my family for weeks at a time. It's not a mystery why when there's a shock and there's suddenly other things for people to do, that it turns out people lose their appetite for these jobs. And, I tell the story of Henry Ford in this book. He's a real problematic character for all sorts of reasons, but he knew a thing or two about the supply chain. And one thing he said, this is somebody who wanted to make goods efficiently and cheaply at mass scale. He said, any business that's built on low-wage labor is inherently unreliable. And he didn't want any part of it. He actually doubled the wages of factory workers in the 19-teens and was branded a communist for doing that. But he said, I just want people showing up, able to do the work. We are now dependent on this rickety, ad hoc global supply chain with no clear regulation, these sort of overlapping systems. And a lot of it comes down to exploited labor, and that puts us all in harm's way perpetually.
Something that in reading the book and going through some of these stories that you're laying out is a sense that on the one hand, you're reading the stories, the truck drivers, the shippers, the railway workers, and you're saying who would want to do these jobs? Why are the conditions like this? But on the other hand, from the perspective of Americans as voters and consumers, the system is delivering what people seem to have wanted, which was low-cost goods and a wide panoply of goods that they can, as you say, go to a Walmart or a Target. How is this going to break out, do you think, in the future between people seeing themselves as consumers and saying, I want to be able to go to Walmart and I want 50 choices and I don't want to pay a lot for it, versus people saying, I'd like to have job opportunities that pay well and potentially are fulfilling? How is this going to break, do you think?
Well, look, low costs are attractive to everyone, no question. But we didn't sign up for this. I mean, this is a system that's been optimized for big box retail. If you go to ports and you wonder whose ships are floating in these queues for a long period of time and whose ships are docking, Amazon, Walmart, Target, they're big enough that they've been able to actually charter their own ships. Their stuff's coming in. When I was with the dray operator, the short haul truck driver at a port, he got pulled over on inspection. His chassis, this is the big thing that holds the container at the end of the truck, some kind of problem with the chassis. So he said, oh no, I'm gonna end up in this inspection line. This could take hours. I'm gonna miss my next shipment as a result. And I said, well, what's the problem? He said, well, there aren't any chassis. And I looked at this lot, and there's like hundreds of them. And he said, oh, no, those are Amazon's chassis. So we didn't sign up for this any more than Stephen Graves, the long-haul truck driver, signed up for the service end of every town in America. This is a guy who's, enthralled to be seeing the world. He'll tell you about the painted hills of Kansas. He looks forward to the most beautiful stretches of road. But mostly what he sees are the same things that all of us see if we're just on the interstate all the time. Applebee's, Walmart Superstore, Hardy, fast food. I mean, we didn't vote for this. This is the system that got created based on these economic incentives where the larger businesses have essentially used their money to purchase political power, and they've used political power to deregulate in their own interests. So we don't have fair competition. And these low costs, well, it turns out that there's some pretty nasty costs that go along with the low costs. And I tell the story of a guy in San Diego who needed a medical device for sleep apnea, and he can't get hold. He waits for 6 months to get this medical device because we've run out of computer chips. Now, why did we run out of computer chips? Well, because everyone was so lean, just in time was the mantra that when the pandemic starts, the people running big businesses think, well, we know how this movie goes. Everybody's cooped up, there's going to be a lack of demand, so we better slash our orders for everything. The shipping industry takes vessels out of commission. Meanwhile, the companies that make computer chips, they diminish their orders for all their components. So when it turns out that oh, whoops, that was wrong. So we're not going to restaurants, but we're buying lots of kitchen appliances so we can cook stuff at home. We're not going to the gym, but we're buying Pelotons and putting them in our basement. And the whole system buckles in the face of this surge of demand for these factory goods coming over from Asia. Well, it turns out that these computer chips are essentially, what chips are made are dominated by Google, Apple, so even the car companies can't make them. In fact, one of the most incredible experiences I had was I'm walking the catwalk at the River Rouge factory. This is Henry Ford's landmark factory outside of Detroit, where he was all about self-sufficiency. He never wanted to put himself in a position where some supplier running out of the components he needed to make his cars could pinch him or run out themselves. And I'm looking down from the catwalk at the F-150, Ford's most popular vehicle, their pickup truck. They're getting made. It's this kind of ballet of robotics and skilled workers, and everything's rolling along beautifully, except when they're done making these vehicles, they're parking them in the shadow of Ford's corporate headquarters across the street from Henry Ford Elementary School because they can't get the computer chips. So this medical device manufacturer in San Diego, they can't get chips. And so there's a guy with sleep apnea who's been prescribed this device who can't get it because we've run out of chips. What kind of cost do we apply to that? What's the cost of discovering that in the wealthiest, most powerful country on earth, we don't have PPE, we don't have face masks and gowns for frontline medical workers going to treat COVID patients in the middle of a public health catastrophe? And by the way, this is not just backward looking. Right now, Phoenix, Arizona, dramatic problem with housing unaffordability. This is one of those issues that Joe Biden is especially worried about because people are really angry about this. Why is housing so unaffordable? Well, for lots of reasons, but one of them is that we can't build housing fast enough because the supply chain is still out of whack. So this idea that, the supply chain has delivered all these low-priced goods, yeah, that's true. If you want to go to Walmart and buy a T-shirt, this supply chain is for you. If you want to make sure that you can buy infant formula without a hitch, if you want to know that you can get basic medicines, this is a problem. And it wasn't just a problem then, it's a problem now.
The report today that there's, again, pharmaceutical shortages across the United States.
Right.
We're not able to get all sorts of antibiotics and even, headache relief. We don't have enough, so.
Do you have a question? I'd ask for you to stand up.
Hi, I have a question. I got your book yesterday, so I haven't gotten all the way through it. But so pardon me if you answer it
Sad
later
to hear
on.
that it takes more than a day to read my book. Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you, how do we fix this? Is it an issue with consumers? Is it governments? Is it people on Wall Street and their interests? And how do they work together to find solutions?
Very important question. Glad you asked it. Well, first of all, yes, consumers play a role. But we cannot expect the consumers are going to fix the global supply chain, right? We're all busy. We got jobs, we got children to take care of, we got things to do. We're not all going to become supply chain geeks and understand the permutations of all of this. Though it would be healthy to think more about place, right? The construction of the supply chain, it's really invited us to forget about place. Doesn't matter if the factory is across the ocean or down the street. Somebody made this and brought it to my door, that worked out. Well, it would be helpful to the extent to which we're able to think about, the old buy local, although that's not always, it turns out, so efficient in terms of emissions. That's a complex problem, but we should be attuned to our own consumption. The real thing that has to happen is labor mobilization so that working people get their piece of the action, they are fairly compensated, so that they are incentivized to keep going to work, because that's a rewarding experience for them, and they don't show up to work financially insecure and ready to jump the minute that there's a better deal to be had. And we certainly need government to play a significant role. I mean, we regulate utilities. Why do we regulate utilities? Because electricity is this thing that we all need, needs to be secure. We all live through Enron and the gaming of that system. Turns out running your energy market like a casino, not a great way to run society, right? And the same goes for industries like trucking, rail, shipping. These are basic services that we depend on that are tied up in every part of our economy, every part of our modern life. And we used to have systems in which, we don't want to go back to the government necessarily setting all the rates. We're not living in a planned economy. I'm a card-carrying capitalist. The global economy's delivered a lot of innovation, a lot of consumer choice. We don't want to lose that, but we need somebody at the government level empowered to say we can't just have secret deals between the largest companies and the largest carriers where all the smaller players get shut out, and where every time there's a shock to the system, it's a chance to celebrate record earnings. That's the unfunny punchline of my book, is that every chapter ends with, and then the companies involved in trucking or shipping or meat packing, an industry we haven't talked about, celebrated record earnings. And that is a failure of governance that has to be addressed.
Thank you for that question. Anyone else?
Hello, I have a virtual question from the Zoom chat. This is from Liz Picarazzi. What are your thoughts on what a Trump presidency would do for global trade?
That's a huge wild card. I don't think there's, well, first of all, it's very hard to predict because we don't know what rhetoric will turn into reality. But I will say this. I remember when Trump was running in 2016, and I was then based in London, and I was assigned a bunch of stories on the consequences for trade. And at that point, Trump was talking about slapping, I think, 25% across the board tariffs on all Chinese imports. And I was assigned to write a story about what that would mean for the global supply chain. And I called all my usual trade sources, people I'd talked to over the years at places like Georgetown, other places in DC. And it was actually very difficult to get experts to talk about it because they all said, well, that would be patently illegal. That could never happen. That's impossible under the World Trade Organization. So this is a silly story. And then, of course, what we've lived through has been much more extreme than what he campaigned on. So that's a long-winded way of saying, I don't know, but fasten your seatbelts. He's talking about 60% tariffs on everything. I think it's important to remember that a lot of the global supply chain is moving not finished goods, but so-called intermediate goods, like parts of the thing that we buy. So cars, there's tens of thousands of parts in most cars. And these parts are crossing borders, sometimes dozens of times. Like a piece gets made in Malaysia and shipped to Mexico where there's some chemical treatment applied and it gets sent to the United States where it gets attached to some other part and then sent back to Mexico to be turned into a car. So when you monkey around with these individual components, there's all kinds of unintended consequences. And I do think it's important to note that Trump does seem to believe in tariffs. he does seem to believe in the supposed justice of this trade war with China that he launched and that he would continue, but he tends to favor the photo op over the reality. And, you know, this is a successful reality television star. And the steel tariffs that he imposed in his first term, you know, it turns out there's like 8 times as many people in America who go to work at factories that buy steel as there are people who go to steel mills themselves. So when you stick tariffs on imported steel in a country that's net importing steel, you have just made it more expensive. In other words, you have made the companies depending on steel less competitive. And there are a lot more people working at those factories than there are people working at steel mills. But Trump went out to Granite City, Illinois, a place I visited in the summer of 2016, where I found a lot of lifelong Democratic steelworkers who were about to vote for Donald Trump. And he mugged for the cameras with guys in hard hats and overalls. And it was a great photo op. And I think we can probably expect more of the same.
Before we go to another question, kind of take that and say, and talk about the anti-globalization sentiment that is now kind of happening with the European elections that we just saw, and will be coming more in the rhetoric in the election. I think this kind of like America first, right, or Germany first, or France first, right? France is a big mess right now with the new. So, what is that nationalism you do talk about in the book? What do you see, and what did you see when writing the book, and what do you see now? This nationalistic fervor.
Well, that's kind of my last book that we talked about, Davos Man, How the Billionaires Devour the World. I mean, I'm of the mind that most of this right-wing populism, for lack of a better term, nationalism, nativism, not far below the surface. On the surface is always this demonization of immigrants, this demonization of trade, as if trade itself is bad, which is, just demonstrably ridiculous. I mean, trade has boosted wealth. It boosts wages for companies that export. It does give us lots of consumer choice. The part that we've done very badly, especially in this country, is attended to the people who are affected badly by trade. I mean, in the United States, the vast majority of us have benefited from trade, especially with China. We've gotten lower cost goods. We've exported a lot of goods and services ourselves, even though there's a trade imbalance there. But as a lot of scholarship has shown, there was a shock after China entered the WTO in 2001, and we lost roughly 1 million factory jobs directly, another 1 million if you count the truck drivers, the catering companies that used to have a contract to make food with a factory that doesn't exist anymore down the street. That's a very real problem. But that's not a problem that's manufactured in China. That's a problem that's manufactured in Washington, New York, boardrooms in Seattle, where instead of financing trade adjustment assistance, which is a program that's supposed to help people who lose their jobs through trade to train people for another career, we haven't. We've come up with tax cuts for billionaires, and we've done almost nothing for working people affected by trade. And we don't have national health care in the United States. I'm not breaking any news there. If you lose a job, it's a pretty steep way down. We have very minimal unemployment benefits, except in emergencies like pandemics, and then that goes away, so you don't really know how to count on it. So, as I argue in my last book, Davos Man, How the Billionaires Devour the World, this is not just an American problem. This is a story of Brexit. It's a story of the right-wing surge in France, in Sweden even, in Italy. When you take away people's livelihood, when you engage in this kind of bottom-up transfer of wealth where the billionaires win, the billionaires use their wealth to amass political power, they use their political power to write the rules in their favor so it's easier for them to make their next billion, people are going to be angry. And that could go lots of different ways, but you have set up a group of people who are open for political opportunists who then typically peddle the same story. Oh, it's the immigrants. Let's blame it's China. China's eating our lunch. This is an old story, and it's painful that we're constantly falling for that instead of holding to account the people who are right here in our midst, who are responsible for taking a very bounteous trade system and monopolizing the benefits for themselves.
Any questions to respond to that or responses to that? Anyone online or anyone here?
Maybe, Tatiana, I know you brought the other book as well from another one of our podcasts. You know, we talk about, you know, businesses, Wall Street, but really there's a particular group I think we maybe should put a little bit more under the microscope, and that's the consultants.
Yeah.
You know, these ideas didn't come out of a vacuum.
Right.
They just didn't appear out of nowhere. Can you talk a bit about that, the growth of the consultancies and how
Sure.
that becomes the conventional wisdom that this is the way you succeed in business, is not, and not to be Henry Ford, right? The anti-Fords in a way. You don't pay your workers a good
Right.
wage. You don't stockpile. You don't become self-sufficient in your supply chain.
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. Well, Henry Ford, you know, let's just pause to note that Henry Ford was a racist, anti-Semite, actually crushed organized labor. Not a great hero for our time, but he did understand how to make stuff reliably. That's true. And he was very distrustful of finance. And there was a famous case, again, in the 19-teens when he was trying to build the River Rouge factory because he wanted self-sufficiency. The Dodge brothers, some of his earliest investors, said, well, hold on, you know, you got, I think it was $50 million on your balance sheet. How about you give us some of that in cash as a dividend instead of building this giant factory? And he said, absolutely not. I want to be able to make everything I need right under this roof. Well, the Dodge brothers resorted to an American tradition known as the lawsuit, and they won. Ford was able to build the River Rouge factory, but he had to pay out the dividends. And I argue in the book that there's a straight line from that moment to everything that's happened since, because along comes the consulting class, and I focus on McKinsey in the book, but there are others, and they succeed in taking the very sensible idea of just-in-time manufacturing, which worked very well for Toyota, and they go around the globe saying to corporate CEOs, you know, the secret is lean, slash inventory, go just in time, rely on container shipping. I tell the story, the roots of container shipping in the book, rely on the internet, and just make stuff in real time. And this becomes a crude imperative to slash inventory and take the cash and give it to the investor class. And there have been moments throughout recent history where people said, maybe we've overdone it with that. The first supply chain story I ever wrote was in 1999. There was an earthquake in Taiwan, and you know, even way back then, Taiwan was very important in terms of the global chip industry, and we ran out of computer chips, and some people said maybe we should spread this around a little more. 2012, the Fukushima nuclear disaster, we had shortages of electronics for months afterwards. Again, lots of people said maybe we should diversify a little bit. A book that I draw on came out in 2014 that forecast that a pandemic could be the thing that shuts down the global economy. And at every step of the way, the consumer class said, you know, don't worry about that. I tell the story in the book of an engine factory in Minnesota where McKinsey comes calling. If you weren't with the program at McKinsey, you got turned into your own bosses. They were known as the Lean Taliban. And I talked to this guy, Jerome Bodner, who's a very sensible business school graduate working at this factory in Minnesota where the Lean Taliban shows up. These young, fresh from Ivy League educated guys in suits, one older guy from the Chicago office of McKinsey, and they say, you guys are doing it all wrong. Your warehouse is full of parts. You know, these $5 sheet metal brackets, why do you have so many of them? They said, well, because we're making these enormous industrial machines. You know, we're making generators, and these generators are so big they have to be installed by crane. Hospitals are depending on us for these generators. So if we don't get that order there right when it's needed, I mean, talk about just in time, right? That actually has to be just in time. If you don't get the generator at the hospital, we have a problem. McKinsey said, no, you need to focus on return on assets. That's what Wall Street wants to see from you. That's another metric. It's like if you lower the inventory, then there's less asset to be divided into the revenue that you're coming in. That's the return. Your metric goes up if you slash the inventory. So a lot of these guys grumble, well, that's not such a good idea. And sure enough, they run out of these $5 sheet metal brackets, and they're having to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars extra to, air freight parts, to pay trucking companies to emergency ship these giant generators, and, on it goes. Well, so I talked to a consultant whose story I draw on in the book, this guy, Knut Alecki, who's in a German office for McKinsey, in the middle of the pandemic, and he said, yeah, we went too far. We really went too far. And I said, well, do you think this time anything will change? And he said, oh, yes. I mean, companies now, they're all talking about just in case. It's not just in time. I said, but what about, after Fukushima? And he said, yeah, companies, they do tend to forget pretty quickly. I mean, that's the incentives. The incentives are still there. If you are a corporate CEO tuning out all this stuff about resilience and just focusing on the next earnings, the next quarter, yeah, something will happen eventually, but by that time, you'll be on some beach with a cocktail in your hand in a hammock. That'll be somebody else's problem. And if you're the CEO who says maybe we should spend more, you might get thrown out of a job.
Well, I want to leave on a hopeful note.
So,
is there hope?
what are you hopeful about? After all of this, after how the world ran out of everything,
Yeah.
it's still running out of everything. Is there hope?
Well, there are some reasons to be hopeful. First of all, we haven't talked much about monopoly power. Pick up the book, check it out. We've got monopoly power that would make the robber barons blush, but we now actually have an administration in Washington that's talking seriously about antitrust enforcement. It's the first time probably in most of our lifetimes that an American presidential administration is talking seriously about antitrust. That is hopeful. I am hopeful that if you read this book, you will never see a package arriving at your door in the same way. I think we can be hopeful that there is an upsurge of labor mobilization. Some businesses are decrying this. They're going to have to get with the program. Working people are organizing and demanding to be paid more. And if they get their way, those of us who depend upon labor, and that's all of us, by the way, and many of us are laborers ourselves, that's to the good in terms of more reliable stuff and more spending power, which is good for the economy in general. So I think that is a hopeful sign.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank
How
you.
the World Ran Out of Everything. Peter Goodman.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.